I have always been drawn to the stories that make you check the locks twice. The ones told in hushed tones around late night fires, or found in creased journals detailing encounters that defy all logic. From whispering ghosts in abandoned hallways to shadowy encounters in quiet woods. These are the tales of terrors that lurk just beyond the edge of our vision. So turn the lights down low and get ready to confront what goes bump in the night. You're listening to Don't Whistle to the Wind. Hello, and welcome in, my little horror fiends, to episode 13 of Don't Whistle to the Wind. On this episode, I'll be reading to you scary stories about terrifying creatures who live in the water. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. Story 1. For as long as I've lived here, there had always been folklore about sirens in the sea just off our shoreline, with tales of encounters and sightings. Even as a child, I thought it was nonsense, and even more so when I took over my father's fishing boat business. It was always peaceful, unless a storm would blow in, of course, and there was always an abundance of fish caught in every single net, every single day. However, one day my nets pulled up more than just fish. It was my last catch of the day, and the nets seemed harder than usual to pull up. Something big was thrashing and shrieking so loud it hurt my ears. My winch began whining as it steadily pulled up the nets on the side of my boat. When my eyes finally fell upon what it was, I gasped in shock. It looked male. He had human skin stretched over gill-like ribs that sang when the wind hit them, a large fish-like tail, and pitch-black large eyes. He had stopped the horrible screeching and was now fully focused on me, unblinking and full of hate. He bared his teeth at me. They were small, but sharp, and way too many to count. He suddenly opened his mouth again and began screeching, louder now, and thrashing harder than before in the net. I was beyond terrified. The stories were true. In that moment, I should have just had the winch drop the net back down. But instead, I raised my hand and struck him multiple times with the iron gaff hook to make the noise stop. As soon as he went quiet and I had realized what I had done, I scrambled to the winch and immediately dropped him and the net back into the deep water. I quickly cut the rope of that net and pulled the rest in, speeding back home, swearing to never tell anyone or to speak of what had happened. Later that night, though, a haunting, anguished cry echoed off the waves. For days on end, ethereal cries continued bouncing off the water, transitioning into a mournful melody, then finally turned into a sinister wailing, coming ever closer each day to our shores. When the cries suddenly stopped, everyone in the town thought it was over, and the men began going off in their boats again to fish, because that was the town's livelihood. That was how people made their living here, and that is how we survived. But they would disappear, never to return. Her wails began again, but not too far from our town shore. Every day the locals would pray as they walked around, and even more so in the quiet of their homes, going even as far to shut their lights off the moment the sun would set. Not a single boat bobs on the water anymore. The few men left, including myself, cut our own lines and let the holes smash against the rocks, so she would have no vessels to cross upon. Even the grocer looked right through me this morning. His hands were shaking as he packed my canned beans, clearly terrified of the melancholic tune. Every morning it would start like a deep, low hum into a steady, ethereal crescendo, full of anger and mourning, causing a dull ache that would then settle right behind your eyes, making your brain go fuzzy. This evening I noticed, however, that the sound is no longer coming from the deep water beyond the lighthouse. Her voice is rolling off the howling wind, closing into my house now. A sharp, weeping cry that makes the glass on my window panes vibrate. The town knows that she's out there. They can hear her. Her cries, full of vengeance, looking for the one who killed her love. Looking for me. I know she knows who did it now. I've been hearing her calling my name, and I don't think I can resist much longer. The throbbing in my brain is demanding I heed her call. There's a beautiful, hypnotic melody now outside of my front door, with whispers of my name amongst the ethereal tune. I must seek her out. I must go to her now. Outside, the village remains silent, and the neighbors are watching through their shutters behind their own walls as a man walks behind a woman with a dead expression on his face towards the sea. No one dared to try and help him, knowing better than to interfere when the sea comes to collect a debt. Story 2. My grandfather always said the salt air on a remote Scottish island coast carried whispers from the deep, but I never believed him until the night tide rolled back and with it emerged a beast made of nightmares. It moves with a wet, squelching gallop, a fused mockery of man and beast breathing a plague of absolute decay into the darkness. The thing that came off the black roads that night wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the sea mist. I had been on my way home. A dense wall of fog had rolled in, and I was lost in thought when a ginormous silhouette slumped onto the road. As it stepped onto the coastal road, the moonlight caught its terrible form. A massive, headless-looking human torso grafted directly onto the back of a powerful equine body, and neither part possessed a single inch of skin. Slamming on my brakes, skidding to a halt, I watched, paralyzed in my truck's high beams, as the raw, red-black muscle fibers writhed and pulsed in the open air. Thick, yellowish veins pumped a sluggish, sour black fluid through its exposed frame. The upper human torso had arms so obscenely long that its clawed hands dragged right through the gravel and dirt, while its massive, wobbling head lolled back and forth with a pig-like snout, snorting gouts of gray steam. Down below, the horse's head possessed a single, unblinking, bloodshot eye, burning like a coal in the middle of its forehead, which had locked onto me. Then it exhaled. A wave of heat washed over my windshield, carrying the absolute stench of stagnant bilge water and withered, rotting vegetation. Where the vapor had touched the tall roadside grass, the green blades instantly blackened, shriveled, and turned to gray ash. The engine of my truck sputtered, coughed, and died as the air itself seemed to sour and choke. It turned its lone, burning eyes straight towards my window. The long, raw arms twitched, preparing to haul its bulk toward the driver's door. Panic broke my freeze. I threw the door open and bolted toward the inland pasture, knowing only one thing from the old island warnings. It cannot cross running water. My boots splashed hard through the shallow irrigation ditch bordering the road, spraying muddy fresh water across the gravel and the monster's front leg. The creature shrieked, a sound like tearing metal and a breaking wave shying away from the fresh liquid like it was acid. I didn't look back as I scrambled over the bubbling stone creek, a dozen yards ahead, collapsing into the wet mud on the far side as an unearthly wail of pure, frustrated malice echoed behind me. The thing is gone back to the surf for now, but my skin still feels tight and hot, like it's trying to melt off my bones. I went back home and started tearing the house apart, trying to find where my grandfather hid his journal, the one he was always writing in, the one he would read me stories from when I was little. Back then, I had always believed these were just scary stories he had made up. Nighttime, bedtime stories to make me behave and listen. But now I had a hunch some of them might have been true, especially with what I encountered today. When I finally found it hidden on the shelf behind old books, it was wrapped in rotting canvas. The leather binding was dry, cracking, and stiff from decades of salt exposure. Inside, my grandfather's neat handwriting grew from decisive pen strokes to erratic entries from 1974. He described the year of the blight, when the sea turned black and the coastal crops withered overnight into gray soot. One passage was heavily underlined. "It does not hunt for meat, it hunts to spoil. If it catches a beast, the blood curdles inside the skin. Look to the flank. If you see the scald, the beast belongs to the sea." I went to bed that night, head full of questions, until I finally passed out. The next morning, though, the field behind the creek was dead silent. My 3 heifers were standing rigidly still, not once acknowledging me. Something wasn't right. I paused for a moment and looked around the small field. My herd of 5 sheep were huddled and shaking far away from them, eyes wide in fear. I slowly approached, hand shaking as I reached out, intending to touch one of them to get their attention. That's when the absolute horror of my grandfather's notes became real. Long parallel tracks of blistering, hairless skin ran down their flanks, exactly matching the dragging claw marks of the creature's oversized arms. The edges of the wounds were already black and dry, smelling of stagnant tide pools and rotten kelp. Their pupils had clouded over into a milky, bloodshot film, staring fixedly towards the ocean. By noon, the milk in their udders had turned to thick, sour black ink. I kept searching my house and found more torn pages of the journal shoved in between other books on the shelf. But these entries weren't written in ink, but scratched deeply into the paper with a dried, dark fluid. The frantic scrawl detailed the only way my grandfather managed to survive his last winter on the coast. It tracks the scent of its own rot. If it touches you or your beast, it leaves an invisible tether in the air, returning every low tide to reclaim what it scalded. The fresh water only halts it. It does not blind it, nor completely deter it. Make sure to keep the fireplace lit. Do not let the fire go out. Always keep salt on you to throw into the fire, and never answer the false call from a loved one. It isn't real. The very last page was completely shredded, save for one fragmented line at the bottom. The third night, it brings the mist, and the mist has no skin. The low tide arrived at exactly 1:14 a.m., bringing an unnatural, heavy fog that rolled right over the freshwater creek. As I sat by the hearth with my shotgun, the sound started drifting up from the black beach. A heavy, rhythmic thudding of hooves plowing through the wet sand, stopping just short of the irrigation ditch. A wet, whistling gasp, like air leaking from a punctured lung, as the human torso inhaled the damp air. A low, distorted voice that sounded exactly like my grandfather began calling out my name from the darkness outside the back door, begging me to let him in because the storm was coming. The handle of the back door started rattling not too long after. It was trying to find a way in. The brass doorknob rattled violently against the lock, slicked over with a greasy black ooze that began to seep through the keyhole. I knew the freshwater creek wouldn't stop it if the heavy mist bridged the gap. So I grabbed my grandfather's rusted iron fire poker from the earth and wedged it hard beneath the handle, banking on the old folklore that pure iron repels the corrupt. As the distorted voice of my grandfather morphed into a wet, bestial gnashing against the wood, I threw a handful of dried salt straight into the fireplace. The flames flared a blinding, unnatural blue, casting a harsh light that leaked through the doorframe cracks. Outside, the creature shrieked as the salt smoke seeped under the door and forced its heavy human torso to slump away from the threshold. When the clock struck 5:54 a.m., the suffocating dark finally began to fracture into gray dawn. But the nightmare wasn't over. As the sun crept over the horizon, the thick sea fog didn't dissipate. Instead, it curdled into a dense, translucent wall, and a figure stepped through. It looked like my grandfather, walking stiffly with a jerky, disjointed gait that didn't match human anatomy. As it drew closer into the morning light, I saw its outer surface was pale. A wet membrane, a hollow, skin-like shell filled with swirling gray vapor, and no solid mass beneath. The Nuclevi hadn't just come to kill. Its breath had harvested my grandfather's visage from the graveyard or the sea, using the mist to construct a skinless puppet to lure me past the iron gate. The mist wraith stood at the edge of the yard, its empty, vaporous eyes staring at the house before dissolving into dew as the first direct beam of sunlight hit the grass. The final entry in my grandfather's journal wasn't written on the paper at all. It was scratched directly into the inside of the leather back cover, hidden beneath the rotting canvas lining. The skinless cannot be killed by man, only drowned by the sky. When the sea rises to meet the land, pour the fresh water into the salt, flood the threshold, or become the mist. The high tide was scheduled for 6:12 p.m., and the heavy smell of rotting kelp was already rising from the beach. Looking at my grandfather's words, I knew I had two distinct choices before the water reached the yard. I could use the farm's irrigation pump to completely flood the perimeter of the house with a continuous barrier of fresh water, betting my life that the electrical grid wouldn't fail when the mist rolled in. Or I could pack the truck, abandon the ancestral land, and drive inland toward the mountains, knowing that while I might escape the coast, the invisible tether the beast left on my skin might draw it after me whenever it rains. I took a deep breath, looked at the rusted iron poker still wedged against the back door, and made my decision. I walked out to the utility shed and flipped on the switch of the heavy water pump. Story 3. Everyone in this valley grows up hearing the old folks talk about the locks and the deep river bends. One of the most famous folklores shared around here is the one about kelpies. A kelpie is a dangerous shape-shifting water spirit from Scottish folklore that haunts said rivers and lochs. It usually appears as a tame, beautiful horse. When a victim touches or climbs onto its back, their skin sticks to the creature like glue. The beast then plunges into the water to drown and devour them, or so the stories say. I had just gotten off my shift from at the local pub when I saw him standing by the willow trees at 2 a.m. The fog was so thick I almost walked right into his flank. He was shivering, his coat slick and black like crude oil, dripping water that didn't smell like rain. It smelled like a stagnant pond of muck, dead fish, and old iron. I thought he was an escapee from the miller's pasture down the lane, but horses don't stand that still. His ears weren't twitching, his breath didn't steam in the cold autumn air, and he turned his head toward me, where I saw his eyes were wide, luminous, and completely flat, like dark glass reflecting a moon that wasn't even out. Stepping closer, I whispered, "Easy, boy," and reached out my hand. The skin of his neck felt wrong. It wasn't warm and furry like a horse. It was freezing, tight, and slick, like wet leather stretched over ice. When my fingers brushed his mane, it didn't blow in the wind. It felt like long, wet strands of human hair wrapping around my wrist. He didn't shy away. Instead, he leaned into my palm, and that's when I heard it. It wasn't a whinny. It came from deep inside his chest, vibrating through the wet mud under my boots. A low, wet gurgle like a heavy gulp of river water sliding down a throat. I looked down at my boots. The water from his hooves was spreading, but it wasn't flowing away from the river. It was crawling uphill. The muddy puddle around his feet had grown legs of dark liquid, slithering over my shoelaces, soaking straight through my socks. My ankles grew ice cold, so numb I couldn't wiggle my toes. When I tried to pull my hand back, I couldn't. My skin tore slightly, sticking to his neck with a wet shh sound, like tape peeling off of fresh paint. The horse let out a long, sighing breath that smelled of rotten seaweed. He took one slow step backward, straight toward the black, churning current of the deep channel where the water runs 30 feet deep. My right arm is pinned tight against his cold, wet shoulder, and the water is rising up to my knees. But I don't feel the cold anymore. Everything behind me is quiet, and the horse is so warm now. So warm. He's taking me home. We're almost home. The dark, freezing waters of Loch Ness in Scotland hide an ancient, breathing nightmare that does not care for tourists, myths, or even the people who have lived near for decades. Everything is prey. It does not discriminate, and it waits in the black depths for the unfortunate soul who drifts too far from shore. The rain was beating hard against Danny's small wooden boat. He had rowed out into the middle of the loch to test the old local warnings about the deep water. He stopped rowing. The surface was as black as ink, and no stars broke through the thick gray clouds above. The silence of the Scottish Highlands wrapped around him. It was heavy and cold. He looked down into the water. His small flashlight beam cut only a few inches beneath the surface before the blackness swallowed the light. He didn't have to wait long, though, before a soft sound broke the quiet. Slap. Danny turned his head, and about 10 feet away the water bubbled. A thick ripple spread outward. He held his breath and waited. Then two pale, lidless eyes broke the surface. They did not blink. They stared straight at him with an ancient, hungry intelligence. Danny panicked, trying to grab the oars, but his hands were shaking too hard. Still grappling with the oars, he stopped, feeling something nudging the boat. He hesitantly looked over the side of the boat as a long, dark shape slid silently by. It was scaled and slick, smelling of rotting fish, and another smell so indistinguishable and so disgusting that he almost hurled. Slowly, a massive, flexible neck rose high above the small craft, blotting out the faint shore lights. It didn't roar. It made a deep, vibrating rumble that rattled the teeth in Danny's skull and froze the blood in his veins. The large shadow began drifting towards the boat, and a heavy thump hit the keel, making the boat tip straight up into the air. Danny slipped on the wet wood and slid backward, gasping as he hit the cold water, which made him gulp a large amount of water into his lungs. He began thrashing to get his head above water when the massive beast snatched him in its jaws, throwing him, violently catapulting his body across the loch. Danny hit the shallow end of the loch, giving him the chance to finally get his head above water. Coughing and sputtering, he began to try and stand in the shallow water when pain bloomed on the lower half of his body. Glancing down, blood was seeping out of a large wound on his abdomen, pulling around him. He began hyperventilating, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands, until a large splash across the log had him snapping his head toward the sound. Fear washed over him as he stared at the beast. Its large body was floating in the middle of the lake, its long neck towering above, but bent, looking directly at him. He was frozen. It then began rumbling again at him, menacingly making its way right to him. The vibration knocked him out of his stupor. Gritting his teeth, he scrambled toward the shore, slipping on the rocks and loose lake sand. When he finally made purchase on the bank, he got up, breathing through the pain, and began sprinting back to town. Danny took one last look back at the loch. The creature's tail, the last thing he saw of its body slowly slipping under the dark surface. Myths or legends involving any kind of body of water fascinates me, but also freaks me out. Just the thought of unseen things swimming below me gives me goosebumps. But anyways, that is all I have for you. Until next time. You've been listening to Don't Whistle to the Wind. And as the tale ends, the candles have burned down to nothing, and the salt lines we drew have surely failed as the shadows have crept in. Don't let them catch you, and don't turn off the light.